We've always been told the St. Bernard was built for one thing, rescuing lost travelers in the frozen Alps. But ancient DNA has just revealed a secret that flips this entire history on its head. It turns out the St. Bernard's true origins don't begin in the snow. They point to a far older global mystery. Today, we're tearing down the legend to look at the science of where this breed actually came from. Because the image most people carry is narrower than the mountain. They imagine a dog shaped by alpine cold, by monastery walls, by centuries of patient work in one remote place. Yet the earliest public history points to a human mission before it points to a dog breed. The hospice came first, the route came first, the need came first. The dogs entered that landscape later, and once they did, they were no longer just animals moving through snow. They became part of an emergency system built around survival. That is where the mystery begins to deepen. A St. Bernard is not a decorative dog in a story about the Alps. It is a body designed to matter in brutal weather. Massive chest, steady limbs, a face that seems carved for endurance rather than speed. But the old explanation says those traits were simply the result of local mountain life. However, research by Dr. Chris Klingenberg at the University of Manchester, 2007, suggests these skull changes were driven by human-directed selective breeding, not environmental survival. The record is less obedient than that. The hospice at the St. Bernard Pass tells us where the legend was organized, not necessarily where the lineage began. And that difference matters. A place can shape memory without creating ancestry. A religious outpost can give a breed its public role without revealing its deeper past. In the traditional account, the St. Bernard becomes inseparable from alpine rescue, because that is the version people could see. Monks, snow, pilgrims, and dogs moving through white emptiness. But a visible beginning is not always an actual beginning. Sometimes it is only the first moment a history becomes easy to name. So the story opens in 1050, in the Alps, at the hospice of St. Bernard, with Bernard de Menthon, and the long road toward Rome. It opens with charity, altitude, and hardship. Yet even here, before the genetic evidence enters the picture, the ground already feels unstable. The St. Bernard appears to belong to the mountains, but the mountains may only be where its true story surfaced, and once that possibility exists, every later certainty has to earn its place again. Then one dog drags the whole legend into daylight. Barry, the St. Bernard remembered at the hospice of St. Bernard, was not a decorative symbol placed on a postcard after the fact. Between 1800 and 1814, according to the American Kennel Club, he saved between 40 and 100 lives. That number is so specific that it changes the atmosphere around the entire story. It is no longer only about monks, snow, and a noble image polished by time. It is about a working animal moving through drifted paths, finding breath where human eyes had already failed. Barry matters because he exposes the first layer of truth beneath the larger myth. The St. Bernard did not become famous merely because people admired its size or its calm expression. It earned a public role in one of the harshest landscapes in Europe. Rescue was not added later as a romantic embellishment. It was there in the lived reality of the hospice, in the cold, in the exhausted bodies of travelers, in the repeated need for an animal that could move when people could not. The breed's reputation was built from use before it was built from image, and that is exactly why the genetic evidence becomes so unsettling. If the St. Bernard was already being shaped by survival at high altitude, why do its deeper origins point somewhere less expected? Why does the DNA pull attention away from the familiar alpine frame and toward older canine lineages that do not fit the simple monastery tale? Barry proves the legend was real, but he also makes the next question sharper. How did a dog with such a public mountain identity carry ancestry that belonged to a wider, older world? The answer does not erase the hospice. It complicates it. The monks did not invent the St. Bernard from nothing, as if history began with a single act of charity in the snow. They inherited a dog with traits they could select, refine, and trust. That means the celebrated rescue dog was already carrying a long biological memory before anyone gave it a name. The wide chest, the patient temper, the power to endure brutal weather. These were not miracles created overnight in one isolated pass. They were the visible result of generations of earlier crossings, choices, and movements that the old story left out. So the image shifts. Barry is still there, still a symbol, but now he stands at the edge of a much older lineage instead of at its beginning. The St. Bernard becomes less like a local invention and more like a vessel of accumulated history, one that the Alps revealed rather than originated. That distinction matters because it turns a rescue dog into evidence. It suggests that what looked like a finished breed was actually the latest chapter in a much longer migration of bodies and traits, carrying memory in fur and bone long before the first rescue was ever recorded. In 1820, the Saint Bernard was given an image so vivid that it started to outlive the animal itself. Edwin Landseer, the British artist, painted alpine mastiffs reanimating a distressed traveller, and with one canvas he fixed a detail that would cling to the Saint Bernard for generations, the little barrel of brandy at the neck. The picture looked harmless, almost charming, but its power was purely cultural, a romantic projection rather than a historical one. The American Kennel Club notes that this was the moment when the public face of the Saint Bernard hardened into legend. The dog became a legend that loomed larger than the actual physical evidence. In taverns, on prints, in stories passed from one country to another, the barrel began to follow the breed, as if it had always belonged there. Yet the more carefully the history is checked, the more fragile that image becomes. The rescue work in the Alps was real. The accessory was not. That distinction sounds small until the rest of the story starts leaning on it. If one of the most famous parts of the Saint Bernard's identity came from art rather than mountain practice, then the same may be true of other familiar assumptions. The dog standing in snow beside a lost traveler is authentic enough. The myth tied around its collar is something else entirely. And once that line is crossed, the old certainty about the Saint Bernard begins to wobble in a new direction. Because the painting did more than add decoration. It gave the public a shape to hold on to, and that shape became sticky enough to hide everything that did not fit. A dog with a barrel is easy to archive in memory. A dog with a far older genetic history, spread across movements and crossings no one bothered to picture, is harder to see. The art simplified the story at the exact moment the truth was becoming more complicated. So the Saint Bernard enters the modern imagination carrying two lives at once. One is the working animal of the Alpine hospice, associated with snow, endurance, and the search for stranded people. The other is the illustrated figure, polished by Landseer, and repeated until it felt native to the breed. The second life is the one most people recognize first, but it is the least reliable. That is what makes the genetic evidence so disruptive. It does not merely adjust a date or correct a detail. It exposes how easily a memorable image can colonize the past. And that leaves a sharper question hanging over the Saint Bernard. If the barrel was a visual invention, what else in the familiar story was assembled later, after the fact, to make the breed seem more local, more singular, more neatly born in one frozen place? The answer is beginning to move away from the postcard version of the Alps and toward a much older, less convenient inheritance. By the time the Saint Bernard entered the language of clubs and standards, the old mountain image had already begun to harden into something official. In 1884, in Basel, Switzerland, the Swiss Saint Bernard Club was founded, and that mattered for a reason that goes beyond paperwork. It meant the breed was no longer being remembered only through stories of snow, service, and famous survivors. It was being sorted, measured, and given a formal shape that people could agree on, even if the older past remained blurry behind it. That change seems quiet at first, yet quiet changes can be the ones that decide what survives. Once the Saint Bernard had a club of its own, the dog could be described with the confidence of a breed that now had guardians, not just admirers. A long coat, immense frame, a particular expression, the heavy presence that made the Saint Bernard unmistakable in any alpine scene, all of that moved from memory into definition. And once definition arrives, the older, messier ancestry starts to fade from view. What had been a living mixture becomes a portrait. Then came 1887, when the international standard for the Saint Bernard was adopted. That step did something even more powerful than the club in Basel. It gave the breed a shared physical rulebook. From that point on, the Saint Bernard was not simply whatever people in different places happened to call it. Its body, proportions, and visible identity were being fixed in a way that crossed borders. The breed now had an approved image, and every later version would have to answer to that image. This is where the story turns, because a breed that can be standardized is also a breed whose origin can be simplified too easily. The Saint Bernard begins to look as if it emerged from one frozen place, with one clear purpose and one straight line of descent. But the very existence of a formal club in Basel and an international standard in 1887 tells a different story underneath the familiar one. It tells us that the St. Bernard had become a human selection project shaped by decisions, comparisons, and official recognition. In other words, the mountain legend was not the end of the breed's history. It was the beginning of its public classification. And classification has a way of covering older layers while pretending to reveal them. The St. Bernard's body may have looked ancient by the late 19th century, but what people were really seeing was a version selected for agreement. The genetic past could be older, broader, and far less obedient than the breed portrait allowed. That is why these dates matter so much. 1884 in Basel, 1887 in the International Standard. Those are not just milestones. They are the moment the St. Bernard stopped being only a regional memory and became a formally described animal with an approved shape. Once that happens, the next question changes completely. Not where did the legend begin, but what kind of older lineage had to be narrowed, edited, and finally dressed in the language of breed identity before anyone could call the St. Bernard official. If this is the point where the story starts to feel bigger than the Alps, stay with it, because the next layer goes deeper than the standard itself. For a long time, the St. Bernard looked like a breed with a straightforward family tree. The familiar version said its roots came from Roman mastiffs, brought across the mountains, and from native dogs, already living in the Swiss Alps, with the two lines blending over centuries until the shape we recognize today finally emerged. It was a plausible explanation, the kind that feels complete because it fits the landscape so neatly. A massive mountain dog, hardened by cold, built by isolation, and refined by long local use. Even the history recorded by later breed accounts leaned on that image. According to the public breed summary preserved by Wikipedia, the St. Bernard is believed to descend from Roman Mastiff-type dogs and indigenous alpine dogs, the result of crossings carried out across the centuries. That version matters because it was never a wild guess. It was the first stable answer people had. It gave the breed a home, a lineage, and a visible path from ancient working dogs to the giant St. Bernard standing in the snow. It also made the dog feel regional in the deepest sense, as if its identity had been written by the mountains themselves. But this is exactly where the certainty begins to thin. A traditional line of descent can explain the outline, yet still miss what was hidden underneath it. A story built from mastiffs and local dogs tells you how a breed may have taken shape. It does not always tell you where its deepest inheritance began. And that distinction becomes crucial once ancient DNA enters the picture. The genetic material does not argue with the old account in a simple way. It does something stranger. It confirms that the St. Bernard is not a random invention of the 19th century, not a sudden shape pulled from nowhere. But it also suggests that the breed's ancestry was never confined to the tidy romance of a Roman and Alpine merger. The old explanation may still hold as a visible layer, the part people could reconstruct from history, appearance, and later breeding records. Yet the genes point to a broader background, one in which the St. Bernard carries echoes that predate the familiar mountain image. That is why the traditional theory feels both useful and incomplete at the same time. It remains the map people used for generations, but the map is not the terrain. It tells us where to begin, not where the oldest traces were buried. The St. Bernard may have been shaped in the Alps, named in the Alps, and later formalized as an emblem of alpine endurance. But the genetic evidence asks a harder question. What if the dogs that eventually became St. Bernards were already carrying inherited traits from populations no one had placed at the center of this origin? At that point, the breed stops looking like a simple regional product and starts looking like a meeting place, not a single source, but a layered convergence, not one clean ancestry, but a chain of selection, movement and memory that was compressed into a familiar silhouette. The St. Bernard still belongs to the mountains in the public imagination, and the old Mastiff and Alpine explanation is still part of that identity. But now it stands at the edge of a larger revelation, because the first layer of the answer has been identified. The next layer is waiting beneath it, and it changes the meaning of the entire lineage. In 2004, and later expanded by studies like those from Dr. Niels Pedersen at the UC Davis Veterinary Genetics Laboratory, 2019, genetic signals revealed a complex story that the old records could not fully explain. According to National Geographic's report on a dog DNA study, the St. Bernard was no longer just being read through monastery records and alpine memory. Its bloodline was beginning to speak in another way, and the message was unsettlingly broad. The study pointed to shared ancestors among breeds like the Saint Bernard and ancient dogs, suggesting that what looked like a regional creation was sitting on top of a far wider inheritance. That mattered because it changed the scale of the question. For years, the St. Bernard had been pictured as a mountain dog, shaped mainly by the rescue work around the hospice at the Great St. Bernard Pass, with local selection doing most of the work. But DNA does not respect a clean public story. It reveals what a breed keeps even after centuries of naming, breeding, and symbolism. And in this case, the evidence suggested that the St. Bernard was carrying traces of older canine populations, traces that could not be explained away as a simple late alpine blend. The power of that finding was not that it erased the traditional explanation. It did something sharper. It made the traditional explanation feel incomplete. The breed may still have been refined in the Alps, but the 2004 study implied that its genetic roots reached back into something older, something inherited from dogs that existed long before the St. Bernard became a recognizable type. Suddenly, the St. Bernard was not just a product of where people raised it. It was also a record of what those dogs had already been before the record began. That is why the result landed like a small fracture in a much larger wall. One piece of evidence did not solve everything, but it forced the story to widen. If the St. Bernard shared ancestry with ancient dogs, then the breed's massive frame, endurance, and steadiness might reflect more than alpine necessity. They could also preserve traits carried forward from earlier lineages, selected again and again until the modern St. Bernard emerged. The familiar rescue dog was still there, but now it looked less like a local invention and more like a survivor of accumulated history. And that shift creates a deeper tension. Because once the DNA begins to suggest ancient connections, the question stops being only where the St. Bernard was developed, and becomes what kind of canine memory it was preserving all along. The breed's public identity remains tied to the pass, the snow, and the work of finding lost travelers. Yet beneath that image, the 2004 evidence opens a second layer, a hidden ancestry that makes the St. Bernard feel older, broader, and stranger than the legend ever allowed. Listen to the next turn carefully, because this is where the investigation becomes more precise. If the St. Bernard was already carrying ancient genetic signatures in 2004, then the real surprise is not simply that the breed has deep roots. It is that those roots may connect to dogs no one expected to place so close to its origin story. The mountain dog is starting to look like the final shape of a much older inheritance, and that possibility changes everything about how its history has to be read. In 2011, the trail seemed to narrow at last, but the bones in the Swiss Alps refused to give up their secret. A study of ancient DNA taken from remains found in that region did not provide conclusive information about the genetic origin of the St. Bernard. For a breed wrapped so long in rescue legends and alpine identity, that silence mattered as much as a result. It meant the evidence had reached a hard edge. What made the moment unsettling was not failure alone, but the shape of it. The researchers were not staring at a total absence of history. They were looking at material that should have been able to clarify whether the St. Bernard's roots sat neatly inside the story everyone knew. Instead, the data stopped short. According to the 2011 report indexed on archaeological, the ancient DNA from those alpine Swiss bones could not close the case. It did not confirm the origin narrative. It did not destroy it either. It left the breed suspended between tradition and verification. That kind of uncertainty changes the whole mood of the investigation. A clear answer can end a story. A limited answer keeps it alive. And here, the St. Bernard becomes more interesting precisely because science could not yet force the past to speak in full sentences. The breed's public image was still there. The massive coat, the labor through snow, the disciplined calm of a dog shaped for harsh conditions. But the genetic record was no longer obedient to that image. It was introducing a gap, a place where certainty should have been and was not. The gap matters because it exposes how much of the breed's history had been built from inference. People could describe what the St. Bernard looked like, what it did, where it was kept, and how it came to be associated with the hospice on the pass. Yet none of that automatically answered the deeper biological question. The 2011 attempt showed that even when scientists reached for ancient remains, the past could still stay hidden behind degraded fragments, incomplete sequences, and the stubborn limits of preservation. The mountain context did not resolve the mystery. It only proved that the mystery was still measurable. That is where the story turns. Once a study like this fails to settle the origin, the next step is no longer simple confirmation. It becomes a search for missing layers. If the St. Bernard could not be pinned down by that set of alpine bones, then its ancestry might not be waiting in one place, one burial, or one clean line of descent. It could be distributed across older crossings, older populations, and older exchanges that a narrow sample could never capture. In other words, the dead were not contradicting the legend. They were warning that the legend was incomplete, and that warning carries a strange force. It does not make the St. Bernard less real. It makes the breed feel larger than the version preserved in posters, rescue tales, and museum memory. A dog so closely tied to human survival should also have a survival story of its own, and the 2011 DNA test suggests that such a story may be harder to read than anyone expected. The evidence did not hand over the answer. It handed over a boundary. That boundary is the real discovery here. Because once researchers reached the edge of what ancient DNA from the Swiss Alps could tell them, the origin of the St. Bernard stopped looking like a closed chapter and started looking like an unfinished archive. And from that point on, every new clue would have to do more than repeat the old tale. It would have to explain why the tale had always felt complete, even when the genetic record was quietly refusing to confirm it. By the time the St. Bernard entered official record in 1885, its public identity already felt settled. The American Kennel Club recognized it as a distinct breed, and that recognition gave shape to a familiar image. A massive dog, steady under pressure, built for cold air, deep snow, and the kind of mountain work that tested both body and nerve. The St. Bernard's great size, strength, and gentle temperament were not decoration in that story. They were the reason it became trusted in alpine rescue, where a calm approach mattered as much as raw power. But the genetic picture keeps widening behind that familiar frame. The old assumption says the breed was simply forged in the Alps, as if the mountains alone had written its history. The newer reading is less tidy. DNA studies point toward an older and broader ancestry, one that does not fit neatly inside a local monastic origin story. The St. Bernard appears to carry inherited material from ancient canine populations that were already moving, mixing, and adapting long before kennel standards gave the breed a fixed outline. What once looked like a regional creation now reads more like a convergence. That matters because it changes what the dog represents. The St. Bernard is no longer just a symbol of alpine endurance. It becomes a living archive of crossings that reached farther back than the rescue legend ever suggested. Even the public record reflects that shift in layers. The breed was not merely admired, it was formalized, named, and visually stabilized over time, until the later image began to feel older than the ancestry beneath it. A 2021 study discussed how ancient DNA can help explain complex traits by exposing hidden paths in evolution, even when the research was not focused specifically on the St. Bernard. That broader scientific idea is exactly what makes the breed's case so unsettling. The dog's imposing frame, its working confidence, its calmness under strain. These are not just traits that appeared in one place at one moment. They are the end result of older pressures, older selections, and older exchanges than the simple alpine tale allows. So the surprise is not that the St. Bernard came from nowhere. It is that somewhere turns out to be larger than anyone expected. The breed still belongs to the mountains in the way memory remembers it, but its deeper line of descent seems to have crossed other paths first, carrying into the Alps a history already in motion. That is why the St. Bernard feels so complete in the rescue scene, and yet so incomplete as a story of origin. The public image has a birthplace. The DNA suggests a journey. By 1955, the St. Bernard was already becoming a creature of memory more than of necessity. The last recorded rescue attributed to the breed marked a quiet end to the role that had given it its most famous purpose. No ceremony announced the change. No mountain witness marked the moment as a turning point. Yet that date matters, because it closes the long chapter in which the St. Bernard was not just admired, but used. The dog that once carried the weight of winter survival through alpine passes had entered a new life before most people noticed. The rescues continued in stories, in paintings, in postcards, in the shape of a broad head and a steady gaze. But the actual task was finished. What remained was the image, refined until it looked timeless, even when the work behind it had already stopped. That is where the St. Bernard becomes more than a breed history. It becomes a record of how function turns into symbol. In the hospice at the Great St. Bernard Pass, the early dogs were valued for what they could do in snow, wind, and distance. Later, the same St. Bernard was preserved for what people believed it meant: endurance, patience, protection, and the fantasy of a dog large enough to hold back death itself. The original labor was real. The legend grew around it. And by the time the last rescue was recorded in 1955, the legend had already escaped the use that created it. This is why the genetic story matters so much. If DNA shows that the St. Bernard came from a deeper and wider lineage than the old Alpine explanation allowed, then the end of its rescue role in 1955 is not just an ending, it is a second transformation. First, the breed was shaped by movement and mixture far beyond the local memory attached to it. Then, after the practical work ended, people kept the form and let the meaning harden around it. The St. Bernard still carries the look that made it unforgettable: the immense frame, the calm eyes, the patience that seems almost older than language. But today that presence belongs to a different world. The mountains are no longer asking it to find lost travelers. The breed survives as a guardian of remembrance, a living archive of what people once needed and what they later chose to honor. And perhaps that is the final truth hidden inside this story. The St. Bernard was never only a rescue dog, and it was never only a symbol. It was a working body, then a preserved identity, then a historical witness whose deepest ancestry reached farther than the story told for generations. The last rescue in 1955 did not erase the breed's importance. It revealed it. From that point on, the St. Bernard no longer stood at the end of a rope in a storm. It stood inside memory, carrying the full weight of a past that had already changed shape.